So welcome to our Parsha discussion, on Parshat Toldot. This week's Parsha is really the story of Yitzchak, Toldot Yitzchak. But this year, this cycle of learning Parsha together, I've been trying to focus on some of the smaller characters, the supporting characters maybe, in the stories. So we looked at Yishmael, now we're looking at Esav. To think about what we miss when we only focus on the characters that dominate the big screen of Parsha. So I wanted to look at Esav. I also think that sometimes the supporting characters are a little bit more relatable. Like it's hard to be an Abraham or a Yitzchak, but maybe we can learn something from what it would have felt like to be a Yishmael or an Esav. So I'm going to share my screen with the sources. And I want to start by reading this. This is really sort of a brief narrative of the childhood of Esav and Yaakov leading into adulthood. And I will say that I often use some ideas from Rabbi David Kasher and his Parsha blog. This is a pretty close replica of this particular blog post. And he starts off his blog post by asking when you would add the nickname that is given to Esav. So you could think about it, you can share it if you want, when we get to that point. So we read V'yetzeh harishon admoni, that the first one comes out of the womb all red, kulo ka'aderet se'ar, covered in hair, v'yikru shmo Esav, and so they named him Esav. V'achrei chen yatza achiv, and after that his brother came out, v'yado ochezet ba'akev Esav, v'yikru shmo Yaakov. And so the second baby's hand was stuck on the heel of Esav, and so they called him Yaakov. Yitzchak ben shishim shana beledet otam. Yitzchak was 60 when they were born. Hey, Charles. Vigdalu hana'arim v'yihi Esav ish yodei tzayid ish zadeh. Right, and the boys grew up, and Esav was a hunter. V'Yaakov ish tam yoshev ohalim, described here as a mild man or a simple man who stayed in camp or who sat in the tent. V'yahav Yitzchak et Esav ki tzayid b'fiv, and Yitzchak loved Esav because he had a taste for game. V'Rivka ohevet et Yaakov, and Rivka loved Yaakov. V'yazed Yaakov nazir v'yavo Esav min hasadeh. Yaakov was cooking a stew, stewing a stew. V'yavo Esav min hasadeh, and Esav came from the field, v'hu ayef, and he was famished. Vayomer Esav el Yaakov, and Esav asks his brother Yaakov, Hal iteni na min ha'adom hazeh. Please give me some of that red stuff. Ki ayef anochi, because I am hungry. Al kain krashmo Edom. Because of this, he was called Edom. So Charles, I was saying that I had a question as to where you would put that last phrase, Al kain krashmo Edom, if you read through the story. Would you leave it where it was, or is there another place you might put it? I'm happy to take audience participation. I'm also happy to keep going. Right, so I think that the other place that we might say it belongs would be up here, right at the beginning, right? Vayikru shmo Esav actually doesn't really make sense, right? Unlike Yaakov, who his name comes from akev, from the heel of Esav that he was holding on to, it seems like his nickname Edom comes from the fact that he's Admoni, right? That he is a red child in some way. But yet the nickname only comes down here at the bottom after he asks for ha'adom hazeh, right? So we have one person, Esav, who's described as red in some way or uses red in some way in two places. One right when he's born and one when he's sort of a grown person. And the nickname seems to attach when he's grown. Right, so the Rambam, the Rashbam notices this, right? And he says, oh, he's called Edom, which is a reference to who Admoni, right? That he was described at birth as someone who is red, but also because he had a craving, nit ava le'echol Edom. He wanted to eat red foods. and that somehow the being born red was like a foreshadowing to him craving this red food. And because of that foreshadowing, he sells his birthright to gratify the craving for something red to eat. And so the nickname Adom is insulting or derogatory, right? So the Rashbam is saying, well, it's both, right? Because the reddish appearance sort of foreshadows the red food craving. And he notes that this is not a loving nickname, right? So maybe if he was red as a baby and they called him Gingy, right, that would be sort of endearing. The Rashbam is saying this is not endearing. It only came after the main event, not the foreshadowing. And the Kliyakar explains it, I think, even a little bit better. And he gives two reasons, right? So the first reason is that because many children are born reddish colored because their blood has not fully circulated. I don't know if that's true, but someone I know who knows something about delivering babies said that often babies do change color a little bit. It comes up sometimes when you have like two Black parents and the baby comes out very pale, or two pale parents and the baby comes out a little bit darker skinned, and there's sort of anxiety, and then the baby's color sort of settles in the right way. So the way that it's intended to be, either direction. Right. So perhaps, right, I think this is the most important part here for the Kliyakar, right, is perhaps that they thought that Esav's red color was just temporary and not part of his nature. Right, lo b'teva, it's not a part of like his internal makeup. And so they held off giving him such a nickname because it is insulting or derogatory, and it's not the baby's fault. The baby's born red, right? And so they held off. But when he said, right, Tainli ha'adom hazeh, give me that red stuff, they wondered why he didn't just call it its name, right? We know that it's adashim, it's lentils. And so why didn't Esav say, can I have some lentils, please, right? But instead he yells red stuff. And so that is when he reveals his sort of true nature, shegala da'ato, that he is drawn to the redness because of some like bad red thing inside of him. And therefore he loved anything that was related to his own temperament, anything that is red. Right, so that's reason one. Reason one is they were waiting to see if his redness really was a foreshadowing, right? I think the Kliyakar is allowing space to say maybe it wouldn't have been, unlike the Rashbam. Once it was evident, then they gave him this bad name. And this, I think, is really about your inherent choice. You can be, right, I would say my Meira is like a hot-headed redhead in nature sometimes, but I don't envision that she'll act like a 4-year-old for the rest of her life, please God. And she also has many lovely qualities. I wouldn't highlight that quality, right, when I was talking about her. And so too here, I think there's a feeling that like there's a kindness and a flexibility, in my opinion. And I also think it's interesting that even in the time of the Kliyakar, that there was like this idea of feeling colors, right? Like sometimes we say, oh, I'm feeling blue when I'm feeling sad, or we talk about how our kids see green when they're jealous, right? Seeing red is being angry. And that seemed to sort of play in, there's like a red nature inside of him related to his temperament. So that's option one. The second option is much more intriguing, although I would say troubling. And that is that the Kliyakar references a Gemara in Shabbat, where he says that that Esav v'hu yoshev tachat mazal ma'adim, that he sits under the sign of Mars. So it's an astrological point. V'al shem hayoto gavra asad dama, which means that he would become a man who spills blood. So the Kliyakar is hinting that there's something powerful about our astrology. Now, it should be noted that Yaakov and Esav are twins. So I don't know how it's possible that Esav sits under the sign of Mars, but Yaakov doesn't. Right, like maybe they were born right as one planet circled out and another in, I don't know. But it's interesting to me that the Kliyakar thinks about astrology. That's not something that I typically think of as like a Jewish topic. But he is referencing a Gemara in Shabbat, where it says that someone who sits under Ma'adim, the sign of Mars, is someone who is Ashed Zama, right? That's what the Kliyakar quoted. And then I brought a little bit more because I think that there is still a choice here, right? Amar Rav Ashi, umna ganava, right? He might be a bloodletter, like a murderer or a thief, but tabacha mahola, right? He might also be a slaughterer of animals or a circumciser, right? And I think like the modern equivalent, I don't know if anyone here ever watched Dexter. It's a TV show about a CSI person who is also a murderer. So like murderer by night. And then he's an excellent crime scene analyzer because he has this sort of extra knowledge from his nighttime activities, right? Or we might say like, oh, if someone really has this desire to like see the inside of someone, they could become a serial killer or they could become a surgeon, right? There are like ways to channel your influence of Mars towards good, being a circumciser or a slaughterer, or towards bad, being a murderer or a thief. And I love this line. It's not really about Esav, but I could imagine like the Beit Midrash, right? Amar Rava. Rava sits up and he says, hey, Ana b'madim havai. I was born under Mars, right? Like this is all like an intellectual exercise until he realizes he could be a bloodletter or a thief. And Abaye reassures him, Mar name anesh v'katel. No, my master, you punish and kill as a judge, not as a layperson. So meaning Rabbah must have sat on the Sanhedrin that has the power to put someone to death. We know that Sanhedrins almost never put anyone to death, but he had to be maybe willing is the way I was thinking about it, right? If you're born under Mars, maybe you have like a tolerance to say, I would be willing to use the death penalty, right? I know in states that have the death penalty during jury vetting, the voir dire process, they ask you, would you be comfortable saying that someone needs to have the death penalty? And if you say no in Texas or wherever it is, then you can't be on the jury, right? You have to be willing. You have to have some tolerance for it in order to be able to serve as a judge. And so I think maybe that's like what Abaye is saying about Rabbah. Interesting. Sam wrote that it's about the time of birth. So even a minute counts. So maybe, right, Yaakov had the great fortune, I would say on some level, right, to be born under a different planet. Like I can't imagine it's easy to be born red, so to speak. And so I think that that's right. This is like how this is in my understanding of this at this moment is like Esav could have been either. And I would say maybe he is either, right? Let's not forget that Yitzchak loves Esav. And the text, I think, is not clear that Esav is bad. The Midrash fills in a lot of that backstory. Being a hunter is maybe like being a slaughterer, and that it must have been very hard to be Esav. For me, it gives me some compassion towards him to be born under this red space. And then the Midrash goes a step further. And I gave this these psukim just as backstory because they, in their amazing eidetic memories, they realize that one other person in Tanakh is described as Admoni, and it's David HaMelech. And that worries them because they don't want Esav and David to be sort of the same kind of guy, right? And so this scene, it takes place when Shmuel, the prophet, comes to Yishai and asks to see all of his children, right? He had a prophecy or a direction that the son of Yishai would be, Ben Yishai would be the king. And David is out in the field being a shepherd, and they bring him in, and it says V'hu admoni im yafei einayim v'tov roi, that he was all red, bright-eyed, and handsome. And so Bereshit Rabbah is like, all red, that's like Esav, right? And they became afraid. Nitiare v'amar av zeh shofech damim ke'esav, right? Will David also be a murderer like Esav, right? Again, now I think that's a pretty big stretch in the shot of the pasuk, but that is certainly the tradition. Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu, im yafei einayim. No. He is Admoni, but he's also bright-eyed. And so he has some kind of balancing characteristic. And then they explain, Esav midat atzmo hu horeg. Esav kills from his own desire, right? That's like Dexter by night. Whereas this one, David, right, Zeh, midat Sanhedrin hu horeg. He will only kill on the order of the court, right? David is a general in the army, right? And he certainly spills lots of blood, but he's doing it in like the law and order system of things. And that being said, I think it is important to note that that David doesn't get to build the Beit HaMikdash. And we say that he doesn't get to because his hands are covered with blood, the blood of battle. And it's not until his own son, who has been spared that role, comes to his reign, that the Beit HaMikdash is able to be built. So even though he's not like Esav, or he's not a murderer, being red sort of comes with its costs, either way. So I think I wonder what you guys think, if anyone has a thought about like what it would mean to compare David to Esav, or Esav to David. I was learning this text with someone else earlier in the week, and she said she doesn't come from a traditional background, so she doesn't have this sort of built-in bias against Esav. She said, but David, like, we know that he sent Bathsheba's husband into battle so that he would die, so that David could have Bathsheba. We know that David was a war lord, right? Maybe. Hopefully he wasn't a war criminal, but we know that he did a lot of bad things in war, and we don't know very much about Esav at all. All we really know about Esav is that he was someone who liked to hunt, and that his father loved him, and that when they had a reunification, that it wasn't as bad as Yaakov thought it would be, right? We'll see in 2 weeks. So she felt like it was almost unfair to lump David in with Esav. Clearly, Beishet Rabbah is worried about it in the other direction. But again, I think it just gives some color and some backstory that there's struggle. Esav has struggle. He's not a ish tam. He's not like someone at peace with himself. And we don't really see his whole story play out because he's not the covenantal child that we follow. But I imagine he might not have had such an easy life in that way. I don't know if any of you, I guess probably Shmulnik, you're my best bet. If any of you have seen the movie called Seeing Red, I think that's what it's called. It's a Disney movie. So maybe, although your kids are kind of in the middle, like one is too old and one is too young. Hannah might not have seen it yet. It's a story about an Asian child. It's a coming of age story. About a little girl who learns that her family has this special gift that when they get their emotions get too strong, angry or overwhelmed or excited, they turn into a red panda. And the women in their family are scared of that. And so as they grow their pandas, when they turn 13, they lock the panda into like a piece of jewelry so that they won't have it, right? So that they'll be ishtam, they'll be calm, they'll be placid. They are not going to have extreme emotion. But at the end of the day, at the end of the movie, spoiler alert, May, the little girl, decides to keep her panda. And her ancestors are like, okay, that's your choice. You can keep your panda, right? And I think that the message is like, it's not bad to have extreme feelings. It's bad to, destroy the school as like a gigantic panda bear when you're upset, but it's not bad to have those feelings, right? And so balancing them, being a surgeon and not a murderer, or a moel and not a thief, right? Those are the struggles that someone who has those red feelings struggles with. But they're not necessarily bad. And I think that the proof, the ultimate sort of the way I know that might be right, is that there's another word that comes from the shoresh, from Admoni, Aleph Daled Mem. And that's Adam. That's a person, right? To be, I think it's fair to say on some level, to be a person is to be someone who sometimes struggles with intense emotion. And in fact, there's this beautiful Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, I had never seen it before, on Breshit. So right in Breshit, it says, V'yitzer Hashem Elokim et ha'adam afar min ha'adama, that God forms the person, who we call Adam, from the dust of the earth, from the Adama. And Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch says that the Lashon Adom, right, is what Adam comes from, because that's the Hatzeva Shekaren Oro Nishbara Pachot Mishar Karnei Hatzvaim. That the color red, their ray of light is least broken of all the colors on the spectrum. So I Googled this briefly, and it seems to be true. Right, that if you're not counting black and white, which I guess don't really count as colors, my third grader informed me, the red is sort of the thickest color. It's the least broken by the light, or air, I don't know. This is above my pay grade, the science behind it. But what's the analogy? Right now we're back on solid ground. Zoto merit ha'adam adom hu gilui Elokim hayashar bioto hanimtza'a ba'olam. That the human being, the red one, the red person, right? The red entity is the most direct revelation of God on earth. Right, that somehow needing to have those intense feelings allows us, right, or gives us the space to be the most direct revelation, to be the ray of light that is least broken. And then I think, right, when you think about people versus angels, right, that there's this contrast, right, that the angels are more like the Ishtam, right? They don't have the evil inclination, they don't have desires, they don't have strong emotions, but they don't get to walk, right? They are sort of stuck standing still. And people, the Adom ones, right, are the ones who are able to have this really intense connection with God because of the redness that we experience. And maybe like the final sort of proof there is that and I apologize because oops, I seem to have left off the English for this phrase. I noticed just as I was turning on the Zoom. So shofech dam ha'adam ba'adam damo yishafech. That if you spill the blood of a person, then right, it's as though man has spilled his own blood. Ki b'tselem Elokim asa et ha'adam, because God is made, a person is made in God's image. Va'atem pru urvu shirtzu ba'aretz urvu ba, that you should be abundant on earth, right? Which is almost, I think, this stark contrast between Pasuk Vav and Pasuk Zayin is like you could be a shofech dam, or you could be b'tselem Elokim, and you could increase the number of people on earth, and that being red in some way allows us that. So, we are not Esav. We don't descend, right? We are, he's that like extra uncle that's in the corner at a reunion of your family, right? He's not really where our genetic makeup comes from. We strive to be like Yaakov, generally in the Jewish tradition, to be an Ishtam, to be Yoshev Ohalim, and all of that is beautiful. But I think that there's something really powerful to be learned from Esav, and to help us understand where Esav's coming from a little bit, and to remember that those who are Adom are really the most direct revelation of God on earth. So that wasn't Esav's lot in life, being under Mars and being a red one, but it could be ours, right? And it could be something that is maybe not a direct inheritance from Esav, but is, formed in part by Esav's experience. And again, as we see Esav, we'll see him again in Vayishlach when he meets Yaakov. And maybe we'll take a closer look at that encounter and to see, what it means to be someone who is Adom in that way and how they interact in the world. Oh, that's interesting. Uriel is saying that this idea of being red, that Adam comes from red soil, which, I think it sort of all feeds into each other, right, Uriel? That like, why red soil, right? God could have chosen any color soil. He could have called us a Kecholim instead of Adam, right? And that maybe it's because we're meant to remember that we carry this redness inside of us on some level. I don't know.
I think that's the only soil there. I think that's the only soil there is.
Red? Well, maybe like gray, but there's like a gray.
Clay. It's clay.
Mm-hmm.
And the word Adamah is also
the
same root.
Yeah, the red goes very deep in the text.
It's that in the Middle East, that's the soil.
Right. So assuming that Adam was born in the Middle East, which, who knows exactly what that meant at that time in the world. I'm just saying that if God wanted, right, we could assume that God could have made the soil any color God wanted.
I don't understand this thing about Hirsch. I mean, red is the lowest frequency, I think, that we see.
Okay. Can you say more about what that means?
Well, color is determined by the frequency of the, light is waves, and waves have frequencies. And the
Okay.
frequencies go from, you have different rates.
Okay.
And the lowest frequency of light that you can see is red.
Okay. And you think that that's contrary to this idea?
Well, I don't understand the what he means by nishbara pachot nishar karnei hatzvaim.
So again, this is like my own sort of just imagination, but I was thinking, right, like if you have a piece of stained glass, the red sort of stays the reddest of the colors, is what Hirsch is saying, right?
It's
So as
more
like
opaque or
as the God light, right, like pours through the window, right? The red, like on the floor, you see the red most clearly, right? It doesn't get broken by the sunlight or the God light or whatever, right? But like the yellow or the blue sort of gets distorted by the light. Again, I don't know 100% if this is true. It's when I Googled like rays of light broken by broken, right? Red is the least broken. That seems to be true. We'll have to do some more scientific research. But I think that if you let's acknowledge that Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch is like a great psychological analyst of Torah and not a scientist, and say whether his science is right or not, this idea that the human being is the most direct revelation of God on earth, right, seems to him to be connected to the fact that we all have that red feeling. Even if we're not born under Mars, right, we're at least formed with that redness inside of us, right? If you look back at that Kli Yakar up here, right, he talks about the red bile inside of him, right? And so I think what Rav Hirsch is noting is that when you come from the Adamah, we all have that red inside of us. And for Rav Hirsch, that means that we sort of get the most direct, we shine out the most direct revelation from God. Whether you think that part is true or not, I think the fact that we all have the red inside of us is powerful, even if you're not sure about the connection to light and God and all of those things. And gives us a little bit more, right? Again, it's hard to be a Yaakov. It's hard to be one of the Avot, but to sort of identify with some of the struggles of another supporting character, I think is a little bit more within our reach. And so to realize that all of us sometimes have that like Adom feeling, right? Seeing red, feeling red, can help us be aware of it and channel it in the appropriate fashion, and not let the Esav quality, as our tradition would say, or just the sort of darker quality, take over the potential good that we could do. I don't know if I sold Charles here. That's okay. You think about it. You can let me know. I'm going to stop the share though, just in case you were reading on that. We'll think more about it. Maybe we'll do some more research on light, which we could bring to next week to next Wednesday. Interesting. Can you say more about that, or you have to be on mute? Esav shouldn't be considered as a supporting character. When I say that, what I mean is that he does not become a covenantal heir. Like his story is not the one we follow. We know he got married. We know he is the father of our enemies. Interesting. So when I say supporting, I don't really mean supporting the person, like that Esav supported Yaakov or supported Yitzchak. I mean that he supports the storyline, right? Like if you think of the star of the story, I think that's Yitzchak or that's Yaakov, and Esav is like a secondary character. Now, and I think that secondary characters play very strong roles, right? Just because they are supporting roles doesn't mean they don't advance the plot line, right? So we need a father of an enemy, right? We need an enemy to have a storyline. We wish we didn't, especially, on days like today when we think of the people suffering in Israel, but that he's a pillar. Interesting.
Yeah, again, without him, we cannot exist. We don't exist without our enemies as Jews.
I'm just thinking about like if you were watching the credits for this week's parsha, right? Like would Esav be one of the first characters, or not this parsha actually? If we're watching the credits for Tanakh, right? I think Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah, right? They're going to be like the first ones on the byline.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think Esav is like a lower ranking character in that order. That's sort of what I mean by supporting. But
He's
yes, I
lower
agree.
here because his wickedness.
Yeah. Right, because he wasn't able to channel his Ma'adim, his Mars, sign in a good way.
And again, you see sometimes they even making the story of Yehuda and Tamar super popular and making out of both of them super righteous because of what they did, which is questionable.
Yeah. Well, so, sometimes it's about like the investment that we have in the character, right? We have a huge investment in keeping Yehuda as an upstanding citizen because Yehuda is the tribe that we come from, right? Esav, we know that he gets ridden out, and so it's much more comfortable to assign him strong feelings. It's much harder to assign Yehuda those feelings, right? And we know that from Yehuda and Tamar come a great line, and so it's very tricky to then read bad intentions onto them, or bad character onto them is really what it is.
Are there stories about?
I suppose, yeah, you're right.
Are there stories about Esav himself actually doing bad things?
No, so I mean, we know that he's a hunter, and from there the Midrash sort of takes it from there. And even we know also that Yaakov is very scared of Esav, but
when he goes and actually meets up with him, nothing bad happens.
Yeah, I mean, we know that from the line of Edom comes our enemies. What Shmulnik said is true, or is how we tell our history, but it's definitely not the pshat. Esav is in some ways like the underdog in that way. There's a beautiful book on Breshit by Rabbi Dr. Tzvi Grummet, who is a modern thinker who lives in Israel, and he talks about how the ideal that God wanted was a covenantal family, and it took 3 generations to find that family, right? Because Yishmael gets sent away, Esav gets cut out of the covenant, and then Yaakov, all of his children become the tribes of Israel, right? He doesn't stick to that model of one covenantal heir that inherits the brit from Hashem. And he doesn't say that Esav belongs per se, but there's sort of like a hint of like, it's hard to know. Maybe Esav and Yaakov should have shared the covenant, right? It's not how it worked out. And certainly Hashem seems to back the storyline as it advances. But I think it's not taken for granted that Esav is bad. I think that is our tradition, but it is not the pshat. We say, oh, what does Said Bafiv mean, right? It could mean that he likes game, right? That he likes the taste of the wild animals that Esav captures. Or Rashi says it means that Esav lied to him. That Yaakov had like the lies of Esav, and Yitzchak had the lies of Esav in his mouth. So he only loved Esav because of these lies, right? The Meforshim are very invested in making characters good or bad, right? So we sometimes whitewash over our forefathers' mistakes, and then we amplify the mistakes of others to make them like the true bad guy, because otherwise it's terrible what Yaakov did, right? Again, I think it goes to our investment in Yaakov. If Yaakov steals the birthright, steals the bracha, like sort of connives his way into the birthright when his brother is starving, there must have been a reason, right? And Rivka doesn't love him. There must have been a reason. And so there's like this comfort in saying, well, it's because Esav was bad. But it does not seem to be the shot. In Dr. Grummet's book, he talks about how Yitzchak is traumatized from the events of the Akedah, right? He's our only one of our avot who stays in Israel. He doesn't go to Gerar or to Egypt or any of those places. And he is, maybe there's the least ink spilled over him, right? This parsha is pretty much Yitzchak's story, and then it's over. And we go to Yaakov. And so what Rabbi Grummet was hypothesizing is that Yitzchak might have loved Esav as a counterbalance, right? He saw Yaakov also as an Ish Tam, an Ish Yoshev Ohalim, sort of the things that Yitzchak already was. And he loved Esav because he was someone who was unafraid to go out in the world, to take risks in the field. And that, there might be that sort of piece to Yitzchak's love of Esav. So I think all of these family things are really complicated. And, what do we say? Like history goes to the, what's that, right? There's an adage about like history is written by the winners or the victors or something like that. Right. And so we read back into our story things that make us more comfortable with Yaakov, with Yitzchak, with Abraham, with Yehuda. But either way, I think it's clear that there is sort of that Adom nature to Esav. And so he certainly at least seemed to be someone who struggled with it, right? He flies into a rage. He has like very little impulse control around the lentil stew. He is a red person as described by Tanakh. So it's complicated, but hopefully we can learn something from the whole messy story of family life. And next week we'll go on to thinking more about Yaakov and his family as well.
Oh, and I remember what I read, but we're going to do it after the recording is finished.
Oh, okay. Let me turn it off.